Suffering is to be avoided at all costs, right? Well, not so fast, according to psychologist Paul Bloom. In fact, humans seek out hardships. And according to his new book, that's good. The book is called The Sweet Spot: The Pleasures of Suffering and the Search for Meaning. Paul Bloom is a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto and professor emeritus of psychology at Yale University. And he joins us now from Roncesvalles in the west end of Ontario's capital city. And Paul, it's great to have you on the program again. How are you managing through this pandemic?
I'm doing okay. Once we're done talking, I got to shovel some snow, but things are doing well.
I think you are not going to be alone in that factor today, at least in the southern part of the province. Let's start with an excerpt of your book here. You write, the simplest theory of human nature is that we work like hell to avoid pain. We pursue pleasure and comfort. We hope to make it through life unscathed. Suffering and pain are, by their very nature, to be avoided. The tidying guru Marie Kondo became rich and famous by telling people to throw away possessions that don't spark joy, and many would see such purging as excellent life advice in general. But this theory is incomplete. Under the right circumstances and in the right doses, physical pain and emotional pain, difficulty and failure and loss are exactly what we are looking for. Okay, everybody out there is asking, what? How can he say that? Answer, please.
It sounds crazy, but we do seek out suffering. Everybody listening to this has some examples from their own life. Maybe you like to eat hot, spicy food. Maybe you take hot baths. You like movies that make you scream or make you cry. You train for marathons and triathlons, or you choose more difficult life pursuits like going to war or raising children. And I've always been fascinated into why we do this. And my book is an attempt to answer the question, why do we willingly pursue suffering? And to what extent is it part of a life well lived?
You were originally, I gather, going to call this book The Pleasures of Suffering, but you landed on The Sweet Spot instead as a title. How come?
Originally, I was caught up in the theory, and I still think this is partially true, that one reason why we choose to suffer is because it just is fun. We like the feeling of mastery we get from suffering. Sometimes suffering provides contrast. You have a hot bath and then it cools and it feels just right. You eat spicy food, but then you drink some beer and the contrast is just incredibly pleasurable. But as I began to write it and think more and more about these issues, I came to the conclusion, this is a very old insight found, I think, in just about all religions and all philosophical thought, that often when we suffer, it's not for the sake of pleasure, but it's for deeper goals. We might suffer because we think it's part of being a good person. We might suffer because we want to live lives of meaning and purpose, and suffering is part and parcel of it. So I think the pleasure theory is right. I think sometimes we suffer to have a good time. But in the end, my book defends a kind of pluralism that says we want many things as people. We want to have a good time, but we want meaning, we want morality, and suffering is a route to getting all of these things.
How have we as a society then got this so wrong? Because I guarantee you, if I walk down the street today, the first 100 people I talked, well, there might not be 100 people out after the blizzard today, but under normal circumstances, 99 out of 100 people are going to tell me that the purpose of life is to seek pleasure, not to seek pain. So how have we got this so wrong?
I know people who will tell you, oh, all I care about is pleasure and having a good time. And yet these same people are often great parents who love their kids, who are dedicated to their kids, who think being with their kids is incredibly important, even though it's kind of hard to be a parent, even though studies show that if you want simple pleasure, probably parenting is the wrong way to go about it. Parenting scratches some deep human itches, but they're deeper than simply having a good time. And I think parenting is actually a good example of how the activities that are often the most meaningful to us often require difficulty and struggle.
No, that's a very fair point. As soon as you become a parent, you voluntarily open yourself up to a kind of pain that you certainly otherwise wouldn't have. But I want to make a distinction here between the sort of no pain, no gain, right? You go to the gym, of course, you're going to experience pain because you're going to look more beautiful after it's all said and done. Contrast that with, genuine psychological pain or genuine loneliness or genuine humiliation. Now, those are not things that you traditionally think of as eventually leading to something good. Are you here to tell us that there can be good that comes out of that?
It's a very good and very hard question. When my book came out, I wrote a popular summary of it in the Wall Street Journal, and immediately I got an email from somebody who was furious at me. And she said, "Look, I live with chronic pain all my life. Who in the world are you to tell me this is a good thing? You don't know what you're talking about." And the truth is, there's a big difference between chosen suffering, which is what my book is all about. When we choose to make our lives harder, when we choose to experience pain, as for fun, for sex, as part of a challenge, as part of mastery, versus unchosen suffering. Unchosen suffering like a disease, the death of a child, terrible things that happen to people. And actually, I'm very skeptical about claims that unchosen suffering is good for us. I know there's people who talk about post-traumatic growth and what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And sometimes bad things happen and people come out of it better. But for the most part, bad things are bad for you. So unchosen suffering, I think, is for the most part as awful as we think it is. My book is a defense of chosen suffering, which I think is quite a different thing.
Okay, in which case then, let's follow up with this. How can choosing suffering and pain ultimately bring you pleasure? Maybe give an example of how that works.
Yeah, so let's look at pleasure. Forget about meaning and morality for a moment. Just look at fun. Sometimes if you take on some difficulty, take on some challenge and struggle, either in the short term or long term, there are at least three ways in which that could give you a real boost, give you real pleasure. One is contrast, in that it feels so good when you stop. You know, if you go for a long hike or camping or a grueling run, then when it's over, you know, your everyday experience just gives rise to a real boost. Our brains are difference engines. And when we experience something, we experience in contrast to something else. So somewhat strangely, pain could give rise to greater pleasure. A second consideration is mastery. So sometimes when we choose to undergo some difficulty or some struggle, we feel this sense of satisfaction because look what we did. You know, sitting on the sofa and eating M&Ms and watching Netflix is nothing to be proud of. But going for a hard run or, you know, doing something frightening or dangerous is a source of pleasure. And then a third source of pleasure that comes with suffering and pain is sometimes it can take you out of your own head. You know, in the book I tell of the first time I ever did Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And for a minute there, I was grappling, wrestling with somebody, and I was scared and I was stressed and it was difficult. But for that minute, I thought of nothing else. And when I talk to athletes who do very difficult and very hard things, much more than I could do, they'll tell you that when they do it, it takes their mind away. It's a sort of blissful experience of selflessness.
Takes their mind away from what?
Takes their mind away from the constant buzz in their own head of like, look at me, how do I look? Am I making sense here? That stupid thing I did yesterday, this horrible thing I have to do tomorrow. Many of us, I can't speak for you, I'll speak for me, have a kind of a running commentary in our heads, and it's not always fun. And one thing about pain, sharp, sudden pain, is it makes it go away. And for that second, you're not thinking about yourself. And
is that what you refer to as a flow state?
Yes. So this brings us to flow, this wonderful idea pioneered by the great psychologist Csikszentmihalyi, who sadly passed away last month. And so he talks about these experiences where you just lose yourself. And it could be the experience of an athlete, like a rock climber, a musician, even somebody in deep conversation with somebody that they care about or are interested in. You have these things where you lose yourself. And you know you're in a flow experience when time goes by and you don't notice it. You forget to eat, you forget to pick up the kids, you just get lost in it. And you don't have flow unless you have difficulty. If it's too easy, you get bored, your mind wanders, you lose the experience. But the right amount of difficulty and struggle is worth seeking out because it could give rise to flow. And people like flow. People value flow.
No less a great Maharaja than Tom Brady, the quarterback of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, has often talked about this. And given that he's 44 years old and still playing the best football of his life, I'm prepared to listen to that. That's a pretty good source as far as I'm concerned. How about pain being better than meditation for getting you to where you want to go? You like that idea?
I talk about that in my book, and I got into trouble with my friends who are serious meditators. And they say, "No, you just got to work at it and work at it and work at it. Pretty soon, through meditative experiences, you'll dissolve the sense of self and all of that good stuff." And I'm not going to tell anybody not to meditate. But I will say that for a lot of people, something like rigorous exercise or a really difficult activity does the trick just as well, and sometimes even better, because it really quells the voice inside the head. If you're focused enough on something else, if you're involved in flow and mastery, the self goes away. While, at least for me, a beginning meditator who's tried over and over again, sitting in a quiet room, my eyes closed, just makes the noise in my head all the more salient. And again, when you're great at meditating, that's great. But when you're a beginner, there are other ways to dissolve the self that work better, I think.
Right. Does it have to be something truly rigorous, like climbing a mountain or playing hockey or something like that? Or can you get into that flow state with something as simple as doing a crossword puzzle?
You can. So I talk about my book has suffering in the subtitle, and I'm very interested in cases of extreme pain and extreme difficulty and how that could be good. But the argument goes all the way down to very mild things. So why does, start with just a question. I like crossword puzzles. I know a lot of people who like crossword puzzles. It's a case where you're just struggling with a problem. You don't have to. It doesn't make you money. It doesn't impress people. It doesn't, it doesn't make you healthier. But we like it. And I think the reason why we like it is because it provides a bit of difficulty and a bit of struggle. I've never known anybody who says, "Oh, I love doing crossword puzzles and I only do very easy ones because I get to do them, get to finish them." That's ridiculous. Right now, everybody I know is playing Wordle, and which is this word game you could find online. And one of the things about Wordle is it's the right level of difficulty. You just kind of get into it.
All right. Crossword puzzles is one level of difficulty. Climbing a mountain is another level of difficulty.
Yes.
Why does anybody want to do that?
The behavioral economist, George Lowenstein, has a paper all about that. He calls it the paper Because It Is There. And his point is, when you look at diaries and reports of mountain climbers, it seems like a terrible experience. It is physically grueling and dangerous. You have a blinding headache, you're freezing. In every possible way, endurance mountain climbing, like Everest, is extremely difficult and in a physical level unpleasant. And yet people do it and they do it again and they do it again and they find it incredibly rewarding. And I think there's different answers. So one answer has to do with signaling. It has to do with, if I climb Mount Everest, it's a very impressive thing to do, and people will think well of me. But another answer, which I think is probably the true one, is that we think of activities like this as meaningful and important. Climbing a mountain is meaningful and important. Raising a child is meaningful and important. Starting a business, going to war, running a marathon. And the meaning itself, above and beyond the sort of superficial pleasures it might or might not give you, I think that's where the satisfaction comes from.
There was a former Prime Minister of Canada back in 1984 for a very short time, and you being a Montrealer would remember this guy because he once represented a Montreal riding, John Turner. And John Turner used to believe that he was brought back into public life in part to experience suffering. And he was a deep Catholic, and he thought that Canada was worth it for him to have experienced some of the worst suffering any politician in this country has ever taken. Was he onto something there well before you wrote this book?
Yeah, I mean, and you mentioned Catholicism, and if Catholics are listening to say, you're telling me about the importance of suffering and how it relates to a good life and work. I think I've heard that already, man. To some extent, I'm talking to secular people like myself who may need reminding of the insights and throwing in some psychological research too. The point he makes is a good one, and it connects to something we haven't really talked about, which is there's a moral component to suffering. We often think suffering is good. Suffering acknowledges the importance of a project. There's a wonderful example from the writer Zadie Smith, who talks about a condolence letter she once read, and it said, it hurts as much as it's worth. And
Hmm.
I think sometimes we think suffering is the appropriate response to certain events and certain challenges because it respects the magnitude of it. And so maybe that's what Turner was getting at.
Hmm. Do you think it's possible to lead a meaningful life without having experienced any personal suffering?
No, I think people could often maybe lead a happy life, and so I think nobody makes it through unscathed. Everybody, no matter how rich and how privileged, has disappointments in love, has humiliations, has pain. There's no such thing as being on this earth without some degree of suffering. But if you so imagine you did your best to avoid it, to avoid difficulty and stress and anxiety, um, if you were successful, I think eventually you'd have a life that didn't have much value. The way our minds work is suffering is intimately tied with meaning. For something to be valuable, it has to involve work and anxiety and difficulty. And if you manage to sort of cheat the system and make it through without any suffering, anxiety, or difficulty, well, you'd have a life without meaning. And people like meaning. People, it's part of a full life. Certainly pleasure matters, but meaning matters as well.
It's hard to do this interview with you without, I mean, at some level, obviously, I want to talk about your research as we have and your academic experiences, but this seems like the right topic to ask you about a personal set of circumstances you may have encountered, which may have helped lead you to this conclusion. Was there a moment of deep suffering for you, which led to added meaning and ultimately pleasure?
Um, in some way, yes and no. So, like a lot of people, I've had experiences of death of those I've loved and things like that. And I'm not, nothing in these experiences made me want to recommend them to other people. You know, I have friends who have avoided these such experiences, and all the more power to them. On the other hand, I've always been interested how in my own life, the, the experiences I remember, the ones I'm most proud of, the ones that seem to have the most weight, are ones that were hard, that often involved failure, that often involved difficulty and struggle. And so, looking at my own life, it helped me get to the insight that of the value of suffering, of the importance of suffering. And again, there's unchosen suffering, which is awful. I'm not telling anybody, oh, go get in a car crash, have your loved ones die. That's awful. But chosen suffering, at least in my own experience, and then you look at the research and it supports it, seems to have tremendous value for people.
And what was it in your experience?
The chosen suffering, I have all sorts of examples, but one example I run through in my book was training for the New York Marathon, which for a lot of people who were in better shape than me, that would probably just be a hoot. But for me, it would involve blisters, and it involved body aches, and involved at one point giving it up and having to start up again. But I did run it. My time I'm not going to say my time in front of a large audience, but it was very long. But I finished the darn thing. And now many years later, here I am talking to you about it. And I think if it wasn't so hard for me, I wouldn't be remembering to tell you about it now.
It's funny you mentioned that one because when you talked about the marathon in the book, everybody I know who's run a marathon, nobody talks about the suffering being the lasting impact of that experience. They talk what you just did. They talk about finishing. They talk about having had a good time. They talk about the fact that they might be 70 years old and still did it anyway. So I start to wonder myself, is that really a great example of suffering? Because it just seems like it was just so fabulous at the end of the day. I don't know. You tell me.
So nobody courts suffering when you do a long-term project like that. Nobody says, "Oh, I'm going to run a marathon. I hope I get blisters. I'm going to run a marathon. I hope I give up halfway through." Nobody who chooses to have kids says, "I hope for sleepless nights and anxiety and arguments with my partner and everything like that." But if it didn't have those as part of it, it wouldn't carry any weight. And to the extent people don't think of it like that, to the extent people say, "Oh, it was just joy. It was just fun. I want to talk about that," is the extent to which it goes back to what you were saying before, which is I sometimes think we're not sufficiently reflective about what we ourselves like. I think people often think, I just like to have a good time. That's all that has value to me. And then if you do a deep dive into your life, or you look at the research into people who've had good lives, you find that the sort of suffering lies there as a sort of hidden component, the secret sauce that makes things better.
Is there a part of you that is at all concerned about idealizing suffering?
I think it could be taken too far. I think there are people, for instance, who damage their own bodies. I think there are people who fetishize suffering and they spend so much time being miserable about it that they don't lead to a good life for themselves or for other people. And in fact, I end my book with sort of the downside of chosen suffering. But on balance, I see myself as kind of fighting the good fight because there's so many people who are fetishizing pleasure, who are fetishizing easiness, and in some way, this isn't how I frame my book, but all of social media, which so much encompasses our lives, says, here, we're going to make it easy for you without any struggle. Just scroll on your phone forever. And I think there can be downsides to chosen suffering, but I think the pluses way overwhelm them.
Paul, let's finish up on this. I'm going to use a bit of an analogy here. Would you say designing a good life is a bit like designing a good video game? If you make it too easy, it's actually not that much fun. If you make it too hard, it's also not that much fun. But if you find the sweet spot between ease and difficulty, 2 thumbs up.
I think that's a lovely summary. I mean, that's why I call the book The Sweet Spot, which is, I think there are many things we want. Again, it's sort of a motivational pluralism. So I'm not telling people, don't have any pleasure in life, seek out struggle, seek out difficulty. To me, that also is an unsatisfying life. There's something to be said for, a cold beer on a hot day. There's something to be said for, for simple good times. But if you go too far on that extreme, you live a life that you yourself will find superficial and kind of lacking. So we all have to find the sweet spot, the proper balance between, pleasure on the one hand and difficulty and pain and struggle on the other.
We are happy to remind people that Paul Bloom's latest is called The Sweet Spot, The Pleasures of Suffering and the Search for Meaning. And we're delighted that it has brought Paul Bloom back to our virtual studio anyway. And I look forward the next time you've got a book out to talking to you in person, COVID notwithstanding, or blizzards or anything else.
Thank you for having me on.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.